Over the past several lectures, we've been thinking about human diversity and cultural traditions, and we've seen how today's anthropologists continue to test and correct their understanding of human diversity. We started with cultural evolutionism, but we've gotten a lot sharper since those early days of anthropology. And when it comes to the culture and biology question, we've done a complete 180-degree turn. Now, we generally understand biology and culture as distinct facets of our humanity. Well, today we're going to take a similar approach with sex and gender. It's time to use anthropology to see how biological sex, gender, and sexuality are unique threads of our humanity. And we'll start with an amazing true story from Salisbury, Connecticut. The year was 1843, some 76 years before women's suffrage. In Salisbury, officials were gearing up for a super competitive race when a young man named Levi Sudum registered to vote. Now, Levi, he was keen on supporting the local Whig Party candidate, and he was beyond excited that he was about to cast his first vote ever. And everything seemed in order because, as a male property owner, Levi was entitled to vote, period. But not so fast. Doing everything they could to defeat the Whigs, the opposition in this small town didn't go down without a fight. In fact, when they heard of Levi's intent to vote, they protested. You see, the opposition party officials challenged the legality of Levi's vote because in an era where females were not legally permitted to vote, they accused Levi of being, well, more female than male. Seriously. And the argument intensified until finally Dr. William James Barry was called upon to settle this matter once and for all. So, determined to exercise his democratic duty, Levi did consent to a medical examination to legally attest to his maleness, and thus his legal right to vote. Dr. Barry's examination, it preserved Levi's right to vote. But things got a little more complicated a couple days later when it was confirmed that despite having male genitalia and a faint interest in sex with women, Levi also had a vaginal opening, and he menstruated. Now, the rest of the story is featured in Dr. Fausto Sterling's 2000 book, Sexing the Body. It's unclear. We don't know whether Levi's vote was actually counted or not, but we do know the Whigs, the party he supported, they won that election by a single vote. This story, it starts us on our way because in it, we see a revealing example of how biological sex can be much more complicated than we may have been led to believe. Dr. Barry, for example, he was conflating biological sex, gender, and sexuality. But not only is our biological sex distinct from gender and sexuality, but we've come to find it isn't even a male-female binary. Like they say on Facebook, it's complicated. Well, let's uncomplicate this right now. So, here's a quick trivia question to get us started. What is the name of the Greek goddess of love? Aphrodite, right? Okay, and now for the bonus. Who was her one-time lover, the messenger god of Olympus? Right, that was Hermes. Now, as a result of a love affair between Aphrodite and Hermes, Aphrodite gave birth to a child, Hermaphroditus. Now, you can see the combination of the parents' names in Hermaphroditus. But more than that, you can also see the two principles they represent. Hermes, male. Aphrodite, female. In Hermaphroditus, these two principles are merged. In fact, both Greek myth and Greek art portray Hermaphroditus as two-sexed, having a female figure with male genitals. And that's where our word hermaphrodite comes from. A hermaphrodite is an organism that has both male and female sex organs. Now, as we'll see in a moment, hermaphrodites comprise a relatively small category within a larger group of people who, biologically, have both male and female sexual traits. We use the term intersex to describe this group, whose biology, not their sexuality, nor their gender identity, whose biology is not exclusively female or male. We've been taught that there are male and female people out there, but we don't hear as much about intersex people. Remember, we're not talking sexual orientation, we're talking strict physiology here. And the fact is, some people are born intersex. What do you think the percentage rate is? Well, not everyone agrees on the exact number, but according to Ann Foster Sterling, the rate's around 1.7%. And that's actually a higher incidence than albinism. So think for a moment of your high school or college. How many people were there? Maybe 100, 1,000, perhaps more? Well, even in a group of 500 people, statistically, we'd expect that around 8 to 10 of our peers would have been born intersex. So why don't we hear about this? Why don't we know more intersex people in our lives? Well, as I said before, it's complicated. In the US, for example, our cultural and medical practices have classified intersex as a deformity rather than diversity. And as such, it's often the case that when intersex children are born, doctors and parents typically go into emergency mode. They make a decision, male or female. Now, shockingly, the decision to go male or female, it's commonly made immediately based on the presence or absence of a functional penis. So while we might expect that around 2% of the people around us may be on the intersex spectrum, some of them, indeed most of them, will have had so-called corrective surgery. On the one hand, it's easy to understand where a parent or doctor may be coming from here. Knowing that our world, can be a cruel place for folks that don't fit in, parents consenting to corrective surgery are quite likely acting out of protective love for their new child. But that said, studies have shown that people who received this sexual assignment surgery, well, they're at risk for gender identity issues later in life. You see, operating on the body can clear up biological ambiguity when it comes to sex organs, but those organs do not control one's sexuality or their gender identity. Rather than reinforcing a non-biological duality of male and female, maybe we should expand our understanding of other sexes. So, what we're seeing here is that we need to challenge the binary concept of biological sex, male and female. We need to broaden that concept to something that is actually more in line with biological reality. Simply put, we need to add intersex to the spectrum. Now, what I'd like to do is to drill down even further to show that even intersex itself isn't a simple concept. Because under the general term intersex, there are various categories based on different biological characteristics. It was biologist Joan Roughgarden who wrote the book Evolution's Rainbow, in which we see that intersex and non-binary sexes are more than common throughout the entire animal kingdom. And without getting into the weeds here, Roughgarden discusses several types of intersexuality. First, there's the hermaphrodite, and despite the fact that this may be the most recognized or familiar form of intersex, it's actually the rarest of them all. One in about 85,000 births to be exact. The hermaphrodite usually has some combination of testes and ovaries, and or what they call ovotestes, which contain both ovarian and testicular tissues. Then there's the much more common hypospadias. Now, hypospadia is considered to be minor if the vent is off-center on the tip of the penis. And to one degree or another, this occurs in over 40% of males. But then around 1 in 2,000 males are born with what we call hypospadias major, which means that the vent is, well, anywhere but the tip of the penis. And even more common than hypospadias is chromosomal variation. Now, this outcome happens about once in 1,000 births. Now, these varieties of intersex occur as a result of an additional chromosome, so that instead of an XX female or an XY chromosome male, we get XXY, XYY, triple X, or even double X, double Y. Now, there are other pathways to intersex, but let's go ahead and close up this first section, which is focused exclusively on biological sex, because we can now explain that biological sex isn't really a binary male-female concept. So let's make the move from our strict biological definition of sex to something more anthropological. Now, don't get me wrong, biology is a critical piece of anthropology, but unlike biology itself, anthropology garners its strength as, well, biology plus. So it's our duty as anthropologists to understand biological sex in terms of the physical body. But when we start talking about sexuality and gender, that's an entirely different story. You see, sexuality and gender are not strictly biological phenomena. And that's why cultural anthropology can help us see the distinct qualities of biological sex as opposed to one's sexuality and gender. So in that spirit, let's move into cultural anthropology to see how some world cultures actually construct gender in a way that transcends the masculine-feminine binary. Now, we've seen gender themes in our previous lectures, but when it comes to many of the foundational thinkers whose ideas shape anthropology to this day, people like Darwin, their proclamations on humanity as a single race didn't technically include women. As we've seen elsewhere in this course, early anthropologists, they forced an evolution-inspired metaphor that ranked world cultures on the spectrum of savage to civilized. Now, this social Darwinism, as this idea is sometimes referred to, extended well beyond culture grades. For example, as we'll see in a future lecture, some social Darwinists use the theory of evolution to describe different grades of religious belief and practice, from the so-called primitive religions to those that were ostensibly more advanced. But now, we're about to see how, when it came to the question of gender, the glow of evolutionary biology, it blinded even Darwin himself. You see, Darwin and his contemporaries, they may have argued that we're ultimately one race, Homo sapiens, but they were clear that half the human race wasn't built for thinking or, well, anything else outside the domestic sphere. And yes, you heard me right. They were clear that women's role in human reproduction is so physically and mentally demanding that it actually limits their potential as scholars, doctors, and presidents. This isn't a glass ceiling, it's a biological one. And to understand just how deeply entrenched this attitude was, let me introduce you to one of my brilliant science heroes here. Her name is Clémence Royer. Now, Royer was a French scientist who was hired by Darwin, and actually eventually fired, as the translator of his masterpiece, On the Origin of Species. You see, as a scientist, Royer, she was the quintessential editor and translator. When she had a disagreement with Darwin, she let it be known, sometimes in the form of intellectual discussion, and sometimes in the form of special footnotes for the reader. And that kind of transparent back and forth, well, that's what built science as a trusted means to get progressively clearer on our big questions like, who are we and where do we come from? So, of course, Darwin fired her. But she continued her scientific career, and one of the reasons I first came to admire Royer was a remarkable and courageous speech she gave to the Société d'Anthropologie de Paris in 1874. She was ahead of her times, and, well, most of anthropology with her succinct take on gender. Here's what she said, quote, "Up until now, science, like law, made exclusively by men, has too often considered woman as an absolutely passive being, without instincts or passions or her own interests, as a purely plastic material capable of taking any form given her without resistance, a being without the inner resources to react against the education she receives or against the discipline to which she submits as part of law, custom, or opinion. Woman, she says, is not made like this." Royer's critique of European science in the late 19th century opened the door to a more comprehensive study of humanity, an anthropology that saw women in their fullness as human beings. Now, of course, Royer was herself a European, but interestingly, even the non-Western people that early anthropologists studied, they could see a problem with this weird Western gender lens, or I should say maybe a lack thereof. Here's a British colonial anthropologist quoting an Asante man from colonial West Africa. "The white man," he said, "has dealings with and only recognizes men. We suppose the European considered women of no account, and we know you do not recognize them, as we have always done. So it's clear, anthropology reflected the societies that raised anthropologists in the first place. And for US anthropologists, that meant a society that didn't pass women's suffrage until 1920. Now, undeniably, Western gender traditions strongly separate men's roles from women's roles, thus developing a gender binary that is closely tied to the biological binary we discussed earlier. And when that binary is crossed or made more complex, the system breaks down, just like we saw in Salisbury, Connecticut. But as an empirical field of study, anthropology has tested and corrected these ideas, and cultural anthropologists, for one, we've found and documented world cultures that don't really have this strict male-female gender binary. So, to get our cultural anthropology on, let's look beyond Western conventions on gender. Let's see how several world cultures can help us expand our understanding of this thing called gender. First, let's go to the Zuni Nation of the American Southwest, where scholars like Will Roscoe have studied Native American cultures and the presence of two-spirit people. Practices and norms, they certainly differed between distinct Native American groups, but the presence of two-spirited people, or something similar, that was actually quite common. Two-spirited people are sometimes referred to as a third or fourth gender because they clearly contradict the male-female gender binary. Typically, the two-spirited person is celebrated as a gifted member of society who may perform trades or skills that are associated with the so-called opposite sex. Now, the literature is clear. Two-spirited people were not necessarily homosexual, but some certainly were. Additionally, these people were not on the down low. They were not dressing or acting with the intent to deceive fellow community members. Rather, they were known and admired publicly for possessing both male and female qualities. For example, among the Zuni, when a potential two-spirited child emerges, they had a ritual that served as kind of a test to discern who this person truly was, regardless of their biology. In the literature, there are a number of versions of these tests, including one where a bow and an arrow is placed next to a basket, and the young child is then asked to pick the one they like the most. If a young girl, biologically speaking, picks up the bow and arrow, she's celebrated and accepted as a two-spirited person, and she'll likely go on with life-learning skills traditionally taught to biological males. Some great and celebrated Native American warriors, for example, were in fact two-spirited people that an outsider might mistake for, say, a masculine female. Writings from explorers show two-spirited people across Native American nations, and they also reveal how European colonists brutally killed many of these people as deviants. You see, Native cultures, on the other hand, they respected and fully integrated two-spirited people into their concept of human gender diversity. Like us 21st century anthropologists, the Native American tradition of the two-spirited people utterly shatters oversimplified dyads like the male-female sex and gender binary. And it turns out Native Americans, they're not the only ones who see more than two genders amongst their brothers and sisters. In India, we have the Hijras, and in the Balkans, we have what are called the sworn virgins. Then in the Pacific, we find the Elytz of Tonga, and even the Mahu of Hawaii. And I tell you, there's others, but what all these cultures and people have in common is a rather modern separation of biological sex, gender, and sexuality. One's genitalia amongst the Zuni, for example, did not automatically determine one's gender identity or even their sexuality. So, when we're talking about biological sex, we were strictly speaking about the body's stark physiology. But then we turned to gender, which shifted us away from biology and into identity. So now, let's bring it on home, and let's see how sexuality actually fits into the picture. After all, if gender isn't sexuality, and if biological sex doesn't determine sexuality, then what exactly is sexuality? Well, from an anthropologist's point of view, sexuality is a great research theme because it requires an interdisciplinary four-field approach, one that bridges biology, archaeology, language, and cross-cultural research. Now, we've already used cultural anthropology to look into two-spirited people, so let's go back and start with biological anthropology and its intersection with neuroscience. One of the big questions that we think about when we explore human sexuality is whether our sexuality is the product of nature or nurture. And as for the roots of sexuality, neuroanthropologists tell us that sexuality does in fact have biological foundations. Multiple studies confirm statistically significant correlations between human sexuality and several biological indicators, including the nerve cells in our hypothalamus. Now, the hypothalamus is that part of our limbic system which helps us regulate things like our behavior, our motivations, memory, smell, and even our emotional life. Located right at the center of the brain, just above the stem, is the hypothalamus, which produces hormones. Now, inside this hypothalamus, we find suprachiasmatic nuclei, what we refer to as SCN. And the SCN, which controls our circadian body rhythm, that gets us closer to some of the biological roots of our sexuality. Research by noted neurobiologist Dick Schwab and others reveal a relationship between SCN size and homosexuality. Simply put, the SCN of homosexual men are actually larger than the SCN in heterosexual men. They're about twice as large in terms of physical size and the total amount of neurons. So let's try a mini thought experiment. If the SCN of homosexual men are around twice the size of their heterosexual counterparts, how will the SCN in homosexuals compare with heterosexual females? Will it be larger like the homosexual male SCN? Or maybe somewhere between male and female? Well, those are both very good guesses, but they're wrong. Dead wrong. As it turns out, female SCN are much smaller than even heterosexual males, meaning women have smaller SCNs and therefore fewer SCN neurons. So that is one window into the neurobiology of sexuality. And similarly, Schwab and others like neurobiologist Simon LeVay also identified another compelling connection between our brains and our sexuality. They identified another nucleus that is understood as the sexually dimorphic nucleus. It's called INAH3, which is short for the third interstitial nucleus of the anterior hypothalamus. Now, like SCN, the INAH3 is significantly larger in males than females, and even larger in heterosexual males than in homosexual males, and heterosexual females. Okay, so the INAH3 is smaller in people who are sexually attracted to males. Last, I'd be remiss if I failed to mention one important, fascinating biological connection between sexuality and biology. As I mentioned earlier, the hypothalamus helps us with our olfactory system. So scientists looked into how the hypothalamus responds to the smells of estrogen, as found in female urine, and testosterone from male sweat. The results were definitive. The hypothalamus of people who were sexually attracted to women, that's heterosexual men and homosexual women, well, they responded to estrogen. And the hypothalamus of people attracted to men, including both homosexual men and heterosexual women, they responded to testosterone. The SCN and ANAH3, and even the olfactory studies we just discussed, help open the door for the biological study of sexuality. And there's more work to be done if we want a truly more comprehensive view of the biology of human sexuality, but nonetheless, pioneers like Schwab and LeVay give us a terrific start. Now, to cap off our micro-study of human sexuality, let's look at one more intriguing area of sexuality research: twin studies. Returning to Rough Garden and our classic exploration of sexuality and sex, Evolution's Rainbow, we get a great bird's eye view of twin studies that have looked at sexuality. Now, collectively, these studies ask the central question we've been thinking about in the final third of our lecture. Is there evidence for the biological foundations of sexuality? The idea is simple. They compare identical versus fraternal twins. The thought is that if homosexuality is in fact biologically based, identical twins who are both gay would be more common than two fraternal twins who are both gay. Makes sense, right? Well, it's true. When they tested this theory, they found it was accurate. And here's a few striking specifics. 2015 University of California study presented at the American Society of Human Genetics examined the genomes of 47 sets of identical twins. 37 of those sets had one homosexual twin and one heterosexual twin. The remaining 10 sets, just over 20% of the study population, all identified as homosexuals. And in two ways, that's quite revealing. First, identical twins are exact genetic copies of each other, right? So if sexuality is exclusively biological, aren't we going to see that for identical twins, homosexuality comes in pairs? Well, it turns out they do. Well, for over 20% of the twin sets, both twins were gay. And that rather high incidence, it indicates that there is something biologically going on here. But, and here's the second piece, not all identical twins mirror each other's sexuality. When we found twin sets with at least one gay twin, a large number of them had heterosexual counterparts. So biology is at work here, but there's something more to it. The most fascinating ideas coming from this research relates to epigenetics. We have a lot to learn about epigenetics before we're really going to understand them, but this study of homosexual twins sees that our sexuality may also be influenced by sets of chemical markers that lie between, not within, our genes. What we know about our epigenome is that it basically turns our genes on and off in response to a particular moment. Amazingly, unlike our actual genome, the epigenome is constantly changing. So, researchers explored the twin pairs' epigenomes, searching for patterns that could be predictive for sexuality. And in 9 different regions of the epigenome, that's exactly what they find. Their approach appears to be able to biologically identify homosexuality with a 70% accuracy rate. Now, that's a lot more accurate than just random guessing. Again, that study, as well as the hypothalamus studies, they all point to a common consensus. Without a doubt, there are biological foundations of human sexuality. But what's important to stress is that we're talking foundations with an S, plural. Why? Because based on existing research, at this point, it's highly unlikely that there's a single gene or switch that makes someone gay, straight, or anything else. Eye color, sure, but not sexuality. There's something much more complex going on, and we still have a lot to learn. So, what's our big take-home lesson today? Where exactly does our exploration of sexuality, gender, and biological sex leave us? Well, it appears that over the long arc of the human experience, homosexuality and femininity, they're no more pathological than heterosexuality and masculinity. They are all expressions of humanity. And like gender and biological sex, diverse sexual identities are manifestations of the rich cultural and biological heritage that we inherit and then pass on. And it's rather comforting to know that just about any cohabitation arrangement and sexual preference among humans, well, we can find parallels in the wider animal kingdom. We're not alone, and we're not crazy. We're just upright, walking, and talking apes. That is, walking and talking apes who understand and connect with each other through biological sex, gender, and sexuality, among other things. Distinct, yet certainly intertwined threads of our humanity, these 3 concepts help us see and maybe even practice much more inclusive expressions of human diversity. And as we've seen so often before, when we explore the diversity of humankind, we also discover its unity, the unity of our human race.